Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kate Vanny, and on behalf of the URI Foundation and Alumni Engagement, I'd like to welcome you to our program today. We're happy to present our first faculty office hour discussion for the fall semester. Today, we welcome ocean engineering professors Christopher Baxter and James Miller, along with Robert Kenney, an Emeritus marine research scientist from the Graduate School of Oceanography. If you have questions for the faculty today, please post them in the Q&A selection on your screens. We'll do our best to get to as many questions as we can after the presentation. And just a note, today's program will be recorded. In a few days, you'll receive an email with a link to the recording, along with the recommended resources for further learning. You'll also be receiving a very brief survey from us, so we welcome your feedback. Now I'd like to invite Dr. Baxter, Dr. Miller, and Dr. Kenney on screen to introduce themselves. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chris Baxter. I'm a professor in both the ocean and civil and environmental engineering departments at the University of Rhode Island. I'm also the chair of the civil engineering department here. My background, I'm a civil engineer and specifically what's called a geotechnical engineer. So my area of expertise is in soils and foundations. And I've been doing research for a number of years regarding structural and geotechnical health monitoring of offshore wind farms. Jim, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Jim Miller. I am a professor in ocean engineering. I also have a joint appointment in the Graduate School of Oceanography. I do research and teaching in underwater acoustics. I've been interested in offshore wind farms since 2007, 8, 9, when we were doing planning for the Block Island Wind Farm. And just a point of interest, URI equipment has been on every offshore wind farm in the United States, and we from Block Island all the way to Vineyard Wind, and everything in between.
Bob?
My name's Bob Kenney, and I'm about 75% retired from the research faculty at the Graduate School of Oceanography. I came here 46 years ago to be a first-year grad student, finished my Ph.D., and then just never left. Since that time, I've worked on a number of projects focused on distribution and ecology of marine mammals off the Northeast US. And mostly we've focused on the North Atlantic right whale, which is one of the 2 most endangered whale species in the world.
Thanks, Bob. I thought we would start by maybe me giving a quick overview on the construction process. As Jim had mentioned, URI has instrumented or been involved with monitoring for a number of wind farms in the United States. My team has instrumented both the Block Island Wind Farm project, and by that I mean putting sensors inside the towers to measure vibrations and things like that, and also the Coastal Virginia Offshore Wind Project, which is east of Norfolk, Virginia. And in all those cases, in general, on the east coast of the United States, when an offshore wind farm is developed, there's a lot of steps that are involved that could have impacts on the natural environment. Prior to construction, there's a lot of survey work that is done. That includes geophysical surveys where sound sources are used to map the seafloor, both the surface of the seafloor and with depth. There's a lot of geotechnical work where drill ships go out and push probes into the ground to measure soil properties. And then during construction, what's typically done is the typical foundation that's used on the East Coast are called monopile foundations. So imagine a 20 to 30 foot diameter pipe, steel pipe, that is driven into the seafloor about 100 to 120 feet. And so that's driven typically with a very large impact hammer. So you're just driving this thing into the ground, and it does generate quite a bit of noise. And then once that is in the ground, they then build the superstructure, which includes the tower and the nacelle, which has the turbine and the blades. So I think that gives you a picture of how these things are put in the ground and all the different steps that introduce things like noise and other impacts, potential impacts on the environment. And so I thought that was a good way to set it up. And then I think was it Kate had a question for the audience to start this off? All right, so we're asking a poll. We'd like the audience to get involved a bit. And the first poll question we wanted to ask you is, the federal government has issued permits to offshore wind developers to kill marine mammals, including endangered species. And please respond true or false. Okay. Is that enough time for poll question number one, or should we wait another moment? All right, false. Well, thankfully we have that's great. So 93% of you said that answer is false, and 7% said it was true. So hopefully we will be able to elaborate on that a little bit more as we speak. Was there a second poll question? All right, number 2. There is scientific evidence that offshore wind development activities have killed whales. And while we're waiting, I should say, I'm going to ask a number of questions to Jim and Bob, and maybe answer some myself. And then I think there will be plenty of time for you to ask us questions and get your feedback as well on this important issue. All right, again, 88% of you said it's false that there is scientific evidence that offshore wind development have killed whales. We will definitely address this question as we move forward. Okay, thank you. It gives us a good baseline of the audience. So I'm going to start with a question to my colleagues. And my first question is, can you explain how sound travels underwater? And would the sound of pile driving, which I just mentioned, be enough to hurt or kill whales and other marine life?
You want me to try to take a stab at that?
Jim, yeah, Jim, you wanna do that one?
So sound propagates in water in a similar manner to sound propagating in air. The differences are, you might know about, that sound travels much faster, 4.5 times faster in water, and generally the sound can go farther in water, and the impact pile driving that Professor Baxter talked about can be pretty loud, especially close, within a few hundred meters or a couple kilometers, very close to the pile driving. The sound can be intense and potentially could harm any marine mammals or animals, lobsters, fish that are nearby. Humans, if there was, a dive or something like that. So the wind farm developers have significant regulations on them to, if they detect a whale or dolphin nearby, they cannot do the pile driving. And there's people with binoculars, very large binoculars, and other infrared and acoustic systems to make sure that there are no marine mammals nearby. But if they were nearby, it is potentially harmful to marine life. So that's why they set up these buffer. It's basically a buffer zone. The sound gets less intense as you get farther away, just like it would be in air.
And in fact, you did mention, I think you mentioned this, but in addition to the instrumentation that is out listening for whales during construction, there are marine mammal observers on all these vessels that have to be there anytime there is construction activities going on to look for whales. And if there are whales sighted, they then shut down construction.
That's right. And that has happened. We have had, I think it was at South Fork, that we had marine mammals swim by and they'd shut down. And so that it's and that not only did they have observers on the big lift barges that do the hammering, but they have them on little boats that drive around and look for. So that it's a pretty well regulated, well organized system to protect marine life.
I can read you an example of the sort of thing that goes on. 7th of September last year, there was pile driving going on out on Vineyard Wind Farm. A pod of 50 common dolphins was seen approaching the pile driving by a marine mammal observer. The closest they got during the pile driving was 500 meters. The observer said, okay, shut it down. The shutdown took less than 1 minute. The dolphins left at, let's see, what do we have here? The dolphins were last detected at 22:17 UTC, so that's like 5 in the afternoon. They gave the OK symbol, or the OK sign, and 16 minutes after that, after the dolphins were gone, they started the pile driving up again.
Thanks. Let me stick with construction for one more question. So we just talked about how they listen for whales and look for marine mammals during construction. What other mitigation measures are used to reduce construction noise due to pile driving?
Yeah, I'll take a shot at that. There is a lot of technology that's used to reduce this intensity levels of these signals from the pile driving. The most common one are bubble curtains. These are a curtain of bubbles coming up from the seafloor. The developer puts pipes in a circle, and usually 2 circles, a few hundred meters away. So it's a lot of pipe, and these pipes are perforated, and they're compressed air is pumped down to these, and the bubbles come out, and those bubbles can absorb the sound. In fact, at the Coastal Virginia Offshore Wind Farm, they had 2 monopiles put in a couple kilometers apart on different days, and we basically did an experiment. We set up everything with the bubble curtains running and everything like that, and then we had our control, which was we set everything up, but we didn't turn any air on. So it was exactly the same setup, different days, but and slightly different locations, a couple kilometers apart, but the depth was the same. And we proved that we quantified the reduction in sound levels, and it's about 10 decibels ish. And they're very effective at higher frequencies, not so effective at low frequencies, but we can get into that if people want to know more.
Great. Let's move on from construction. Construction is a relatively short period of time in the life of these structures. Maybe we could talk about the operational noise that they create. So these things are spinning when it's windy. They vibrate. Could you both comment on the level of noise that we're putting into the ocean from the wind towers?
Jim can talk about the noise levels, the specific levels, in terms of the federal permits that are needed for the activity. The federal agencies consider the operational noise so low that it doesn't even need a permit.
I agree. We've measured operational noise at a couple different wind farms now. Actually, just about everyone. And the operational noise is very, very low. They're a little bit different at Block Island because Block Island was a lattice jacket structure. They're basically tables with 4 legs driven in. That was very stiff and didn't shake much at all. The monopiles at Seavow, they vibrate just a little bit, and we detected a little bit more noise, but it's still very, very low, much less than a boat driving by. So if you had a fishing boat or something like that, it's much less than the noise that's put into the water by a whale watching boat or something like that. So it's
another question about sighting. when developers are siting offshore wind farms, do they take marine mammals into consideration?
Absolutely. The National Environmental Policy Act lays out all of the steps that are needed for any sort of federal activity on land or in the ocean. So in order for the federal government to do something or to permit somebody else to do something, they have to follow these steps. And those steps include environmental impact statements. And if there are endangered species present, there's this whole consultation process that goes on for all the endangered species. If it's an area that has lots of endangered species and it's an important feeding ground or a breeding ground, it will be excluded from consideration.
They also restrict pile driving to certain times of the year when it is less likely that whales would be present. So, for instance, some of the permits in the Northeast have been, from April 1st to end of October, because there's a right whale migration in those locations. So, and then also pile driving has been restricted to daytime to facilitate observations and everything like that. So there's seasonal restrictions, there's daytime restrictions. If it's foggy, you can't pile drive in foggy weather, because you can't see the marine mammals if they're coming. So there's lots of restrictions that these developers have to deal with.
Thanks. We're already getting some messages or questions in the chat, and this one seems pretty relevant. I'll read the question, and it relates back to bubble curtains. Have we solved the problem of sound escaping from the bubble curtain, and also mitigation along the seabed? Does sound that is transmitted through the sediment get emitted into the water column, or is it contained in the seabed?
Oh, that questioner
Great
gets
question.
extra. That questioner gets 1 million extra credit points for their grade they get from today. That is such a wonderful question. So the bubble screens come up from pipes that are sitting on the seabed, and the question is, does sound go underneath the pipes through the seabed? And it does. And we have been thinking about that a lot. There are some ideas we haven't put them into practice yet. So how do you, one of the most important modes of propagation is through what are called interface waves or surface waves. They're also called Rayleigh waves or Schulte waves. These are waves that the seabed actually ripples. And so we've been doing research on that, and haven't implemented anything yet, but we're thinking about it. The sound does escape. And we think we have some ideas of how to reduce the sound even further. That's such a good question. Wow.
And Jim and I have talked about that. Jim and I have talked about that question many times in our offices.
Yeah. We got
this
some
is maybe another
patents ready. We got some patents to submit first before we tell people how we're going to solve it.
Yeah. This is maybe just a quick question related. Is the pile driving activity picked up by the network of PAM observing buoys?
Oh, that's a good question too. So we do put out a number of systems. PAM is, by the way, passive acoustic monitoring, PAM buoys. And we often, the developer puts out their own buoys that have hydrophones that listen. And we've been contracted with the federal government for years now to do our measurements. So these sounds have been recorded and picked up out to 25, 30 kilometers. So it goes out pretty far, and it's detectable above, the background ambient noise.
Great. Okay. I'm going to switch gears a little bit, and I want to ask a question, maybe get right to the heart of the matter, which is maybe why we convened this session today. And I'm going to preface the question by reading something that I read in the Providence Journal this morning. So on the front page of the Providence Journal this morning, there's some discussion of a mayoral race in Rhode Island, and there were some questions posed to the candidates in that mayoral race. And in response to a question about climate change, one of the candidates responded with this sentence: I do not want one more offshore windmill built because hundreds of whales have beached themselves and died from offshore wind. So that's, Bob, you want to respond to that?
Well, to be polite about it, that's misinformation. We have zero evidence for any whale or any other marine mammal dying as a result of the exploration, the construction, or the operation of wind farms. One of the reasons that we do these things is there is so much misinformation out there that needs to be combated. So zero evidence, absolutely none. That's why
I agree.
since we asked those 2 poll questions at the beginning as a gauge for how many people are operating based on misinformation, mostly that they get from social media.
I'll just add that there's been, press reports of marine mammals strand. By the way, marine mammals strand all the time. They die and they got to go somewhere. But associated with wind farms, no, there's no evidence for that. I agree with Professor Kenney. There have been reports of marine mammals stranding, and they blame wind farms, but wind farms weren't even being worked on at that day, so even that month. So you have to take those with a grain of salt and depend upon the scientific literature. And there's lots of smart people, lots of smart people working on this problem. And the right, especially the right whale, right? There's 400 or so left. We know the names of all of them, and these whales are not being hurt by offshore wind. They're being run. The ones that, many of them, get run over by ships, commercial ships, or they get caught in fish nets. There's, if you include dolphins and porpoise, there's 100,000 marine mammals, dolphins, and porpoises a year are caught in fish nets and die. 100,000, mostly porpoise and dolphins, but also some of these right whales, which are, we're down to 400 of them. So, and many of these animals, if you look at their backs, right, they have strikes, propeller strikes, and things like that. So, they're being threatened by human activity, but it's more like shipping and fishing.
So the developers have to apply for permits for anything that has the potential to harm marine mammals. And opponents of the wind farms like to read those permit applications and then add up all the numbers. So here's a quote from a white paper issued by one of the opponents. The high-resolution geophysical surveys used to site offshore wind turbines cause harm and mortality to marine mammals. Soon the approved incidental take count will permit wind companies to disturb, injure, or cause the death of 590,374 marine mammals. They're not making up those numbers. They're just adding up the permit totals. In fact, the total's up over 700,000 now. But they are lying because none of the permits are permitting mortality. So the total number of permits to kill any marine mammals are 0. And out of that 590,000 total, 1,390, or 0.25%, are to cause injury, and the rest are to cause disturbance. So 99.75% disturbance.
Yeah. So
and because they're permitted doesn't mean that they happen. So this is a table from phase 1 of Vineyard Wind construction. They were permitted 115 level A takes. Those are minor injuries. They were permitted 7,163 level B takes, or disturbance, what I think of as the lawn guy with the leaf blower on Sunday morning while I'm trying to have my coffee. The actual takes that were observed by the marine mammal observers were 0 level A takes and 324 level B takes, or about 4.5% of what was allowed on the permit. Just because they're permitted doesn't mean they actually happen.
Thanks. There's actually a very specific question in the chat related to that, and I'm going to read it. Can the frequencies used by sparkers and G&G surveying harass whales? So sparkers are the sound source that are often used for some geophysical surveys. And if so, at what ranges? And then the follow-up would be, can you comment on how far acoustic energy from these surveys propagate? And if the marine mammals are harassed, can we determine the metabolic cost to a large animal? There's a lot in there, but it seems very specific to what we're talking about right now.
So that it's a good question. Many of these systems are systems which have beams that point downward, because the goal is to image the seafloor structure in a specific location. And what that means is that the sound is going into the bottom. It's bouncing up and down, but it doesn't really go very far out. There has been no evidence, scientific papers on any of those geophysical explorations for wind farms affecting animals. There has been some evidence for oil exploration using air guns, and those there has been some evidence of some impact on behavior. No injury. There's no injury in all of this, and just like Professor Kenney said, it's all just, are they being bothered? And this metabolic cost, I'll let Bob maybe talk about that, but there could be something where they swim away and it costs them something to swim away from a site, but it's pretty subtle if there's any at all.
Yeah, if there is a cost, it is so minor that we can't measure it. Right. And the disturbance impact on a whale is going to be less than the disturbance impact on me, because I can't move to the neighbor's house when the leaf blower is bothering me. I'm stuck in my location, but the whale can just move off until it's quiet enough that it's not disturbed anymore. And whales have been disturbed for thousands of years. There's all kinds of noises in the ocean that are at the level which might cause them to move someplace else. But they come back.
That's great. And just to follow up on what Jim was talking about with these sound sources, they're not like depth charges which radiate sound in all directions, right? These are very directional, as Jim mentioned, to map the seafloor, and the energy input depends on the depth that they're looking for. So in the oil industry, they're looking at kilometers of penetration because they're trying to look for oil reserves, and in geophysical surveys for offshore wind, you're talking about 200 feet of penetration in the sediment that we're interested in. So it is a different level of energy than is used in oil exploration.
That's another common source of misinformation by the opponents too. They like to keep talking about the seismic exploration when it's really the geophysical stuff. That the seismic is the oil industry things that are much louder.
Let me ask one more question.
Go ahead. And I just to reaffirm that there has been some evidence of behavioral disturbance from these seismic exploration, air gun arrays, the large, many square kilometers of air guns and towed arrays of hydrophones. Those are all over the ocean, all over the world, and you could hear them a long, long way away. And so there is some evidence that has affected migration patterns and things like that, but not in the wind industry. I don't know of anything like that. Go ahead, Chris. Sorry.
That's okay. We've got more specific questions in the chat, but I did want to just ask one more thing about the North Atlantic right whale. Given that it's so endangered, what are the biggest threats to their survival?
I just happen to have another table here on a piece of paper in front of me. Anyone can go and look on, if you Google marine mammal UME, it'll take you right to the website. And every time a whale dies or is injured, the numbers get updated. So as of yesterday, the total number of injuries, mortalities, and non-serious injuries from vessel strikes was 25, from fisheries entanglement was 26, out of a total of 148 cases in all. So, and wind farms is not one of the columns on the table.
Thank you.
Right whales are a special case because they are so endangered. There are dedicated funds to do necropsies. So every dead right whale, there's an attempt to get it on shore and do a complete necropsy, take it all the way down to the skeleton. That's not the case with humpback whales and minke whales and dolphins and all the other species, because they're not so critically endangered. And so a lot of times the necropsies just don't get done, or they're done, but not complete and not timely enough.
Great. I'm trying to balance sort of general questions with specific ones. I'm going to switch to a specific question that's in the chat. Can you talk about infrasound and its effect on cells?
Okay. Infrasound means it's sound at frequencies below our hearing. So our hearing starts around 20 hertz, 30, 40 hertz. So the infrasound is sound that is below that. And you're getting into biology. I was saying my biology is not that good. I do the physics and engineering and signal processing. But I know of no studies on the effect of infrasound on cells. Infrasound, for instance, 20 hertz, these sound waves have wavelengths, and 20 hertz is something like 75 meters, or 250 feet between the wave crests of the sound, and cells are tiny, 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 tiny. So usually sound and something interacts with it. They have to be sort of on the same wavelength and size to get some sort of an effect. So Bob,
Okay.
maybe you could.
I don't know of any. I think if infrasound was capable of injuring humans, they wouldn't allow people to look at elephants in zoos, because elephants produce infrasound.
Mm. What's more important to whales, particle velocities or pressure variation?
Oh, that sounds like a ringer question. Somebody knows what they're talking about.
Yeah.
So just to give the folks that aren't in on this, is sound is a wave. It's a pressure wave, but it's also the particles move, and we call particle velocity, and they move back and forth. And for whales, I would think that the pressure component of the wave is more important. For fish, especially fish without swim bladders, the particle velocity is more important, because fish hear the particle velocity component of sound. It's a really interesting question.
I think you know more about biology than you confess.
Sixth grade. I was telling you, this is the last time I took a biology course was sixth grade. I hate biology because I had to memorize stuff. I want to derive it. So.
All right, one more specific question, and then I'll get back to the general. Is there any influence of depth or location on an acoustic receiver relative to the source in what is received? And the question is, if I go out in a boat and listen, are there any hot or cold spots? Can citizen measurements be compared to scientific measurements that have happened to date?
Wow. Sound does have hot spots and cold spots. There are things called shadow zones. Usually in deep water, you can get areas in which the sound does not propagate because the sound speed profile is not a constant. It's usually high speed in the it goes with temperature, pressure, and depth. So higher temperature, salinity, and depth. So warm waters are faster, cold waters are slower, but deep waters are faster. See, in the deep water, you get a channel of sound, and that channel can create hot spots, sometimes called acoustics, and less intense spots called shadow zones. And those are, that's a deep water phenomenon. And it's hard for the citizen to get the hydrophone out to go to, especially off of Rhode Island, which is, takes hours and hours and hours to get to deep water. If you go into shallow water in Narragansett Bay, a lot of those, it's a little bit more complicated. You still can get low and high, but they're not going to be as pronounced. And you can certainly get a hydrophone. The hydrophones you can get kits and things like that are pretty inexpensive, and you can go and measure the sound. It's a really great thing for the kids to get involved with science projects and things like that. So.
Thanks. A little bit more general. So we've been talking about potential effects on whales. Do offshore wind farms affect smaller fish populations or plankton that might serve as food for whales?
There is some concern that the effect of the wind farms slowing down the wind will change the small scale circulation pattern, which doesn't affect the prey of most whales, because most whales are eating things like schooling fishes that aren't affected so much by small scale currents. But right whales feed on copepods, which are things the size of rice. And they have to be packed into dense patches to make it worthwhile for a whale to skim them out. And the formation of those patches is more physics than biology. So the National Academies of Science convened an expert panel to look at that, to say, is this going to harm whales? And their conclusion was that it's such a complicated thing that it might be good, it might be bad, it might be neutral. We can't really answer that question yet.
Chris, you know a little bit about this also, but Professor King, John King at the Graduate School of Oceanography, recently retired, did a lot of work on the artificial reefs associated with the Block Island Wind Farm and other wind farms. These steel structures that are stuck, they're big pipe that stuck in the ground, attracts barnacles and mussels, which attract little fish, which attract bigger fish. So and this is a well-known phenomenon for oil exploration and oil wells in the Gulf of Mexico. They've been known about this. And in fact, to take away an oil exploration well in the Gulf of Mexico, you need an environmental impact statement, because it's an artificial reef and it's going to affect the population of fish. So in some ways, it's probably a positive to have that hard structure there. And when you look at pictures of the base of the Block Island Wind Farm structure, we talked earlier about this lattice jacket structure. It's basically a four-legged table. If you look at where the legs of the table go into the seafloor, it's filled with mussels and little fish, and so it's positively affected the ecosystem. It's enriched the ecosystem.
Yeah, I agree. I know that recreational fishermen love to go out to Block Island, love to go out to Seavow. There's lots of activity out there. I think there's over 35 questions in the chat. So I think I'm going to start switching to those to see if we can get to most of those before we wrap up in our time. So I'm going to start with this question. Is it possible that survey noise or pile driving noise can deafen marine mammals and make them more susceptible to ship strike? Can this help explain the unusual mortality events that is temporarily consistent with offshore industrial activities?
The unusual mortality event started before even the surveys began, and way before the construction began. So they're not temporally consistent. The survey noise, if the whale is right next to the boat, it can cause temporary deafness in certain frequency ranges. In fact, some of the surveys are above the hearing range of large whales, so it doesn't affect them at all. For pile driving, if they're really close, it can cause possibly permanent hearing loss in a certain frequency range or temporary loss. But not total deafness, no.
And that would only happen. That would only happen if the whale is very close, like, 100 meters away, 10 meters away. You get, and these they put circles around, right, to keep. If the whale comes inside the circle, they stop. So that's the reason, is to keep whales from having temporary threshold shifts, or even worse, permanent, right? Temporary threshold shifts is like the rock concert. You go to a rock concert, you come out and you don't hear very well, and by the next day you can hear again. That's temporary. But then there's permanent injury, and that's and everything's set up for keeping temporary threshold shifts from happening. That's why they set the ranges. So because if you prevent temporary, then you automatically prevent permanent. So that's where the criteria are set.
What is the frequency range that whales can detect?
Depends on the species.
Yeah.
The people who do that sort of thing, they classify marine mammals into low frequency hearers, mid frequency hearers, and high frequency hearers. So we expect that they hear pretty much in the same range that they produce sounds. Fin whales and blue whales produce infrasound, sounds that we can't hear, 20 hertz, 16 hertz and lower. Harbor porpoises produce very high frequency sounds, also some sounds higher than we can hear.
Yeah, they're all over the place. One of the things I just have to tell you, we put our hydrophones in the water south of Rhode Island for any one of the wind farms, and we always hear fins. Fins are and humpbacks, and it's amazing how rich the waters south of New England are in terms of whales. They are almost always, we're listening to them, and in fact sometimes we're listening to the pile driving, and the whales are also calling at the same time. So they're within range, and we didn't quite know where everything was, but it didn't stop their. It's a really interesting question. If we could figure this out, I could write a paper and make myself famous, but I don't have need more money for that. So.
Next question. Once the wind farms are operational and running, have they impacted the migration and feeding patterns of marine mammals? And do marine mammals still travel in the areas of offshore wind farms?
They do. They're going right by. They've been going right by this area for eons, and they don't really care. Right? They're doing their thing. This is me being anthropomorphizing, right? Putting my places off of a whale. They don't care about these things. They're trying to find a date and trying to eat. So it's their thing. So we got to make sure we're not interfering with trying to find a date and trying to eat.
Yeah, we don't have that long experience with wind farms in the U.S., but in Europe, they found that seals took off when they were doing the pile driving, and once the pile driving was over, they came back. And
I do know that humpback whales have swum right through the Block Island Wind Farm project. I've spoken to several people who have seen them in that area. So
yeah, can I just add? We've got a paper. We've actually got a number of papers on this for the Block Island Wind Farm. When the construction finished, it's like 2015, maybe around Halloween. I think in the next week we didn't pick up our equipment because we just didn't have a boat to pick it up. So and it turned out a fin whale came flying by from east to west, went within, I don't know, really close, like quarter mile from our sensors, and it was amazingly loud, and we were able to track the whale, and it was, and we've also heard them during the pile drive. This was right after, like a week after, but we've got a paper on that. My PhD student, now assistant research professor, Jen Amaral, wrote a wonderful paper on how that worked. And yeah.
It's great. It's clear that we have some questioning people or skeptics in the audience. So I'm glad for these. These are great questions that we're getting. So the next one is, why isn't Cox's Ledge considered a habitat of particular concern and thus prevented from offshore wind development?
Didn't they take Cox's Ledge out of the footprint of the wind farm that was going to go on it?
I don't know.
they did take out some of the lease blocks because of Cox's Ledge.
Okay. This is a question about construction. Can you comment on the benefits versus cost of aerial observation for large marine mammals?
Well,
Jim, do you know if they, go ahead.
I've been involved in aerial surveys since I was a grad student. One of the costs is we have to fly higher now because we don't want to run into things. So typically our surveys used to be at 750 feet or 1,000 feet. Now they're at 1,500 feet. But there's no particular extra benefit or extra cost other than being more careful.
Question, who is counting incidental takes of marine mammals? Specifically, what agency? And if all of the takes are used, would the construction stop?
That's a good question. If it's if the permit says when you get to your permitted level of takes, you have to quit, then they would have to quit. But so far, like I said, the level B takes for Vineyard Wind Phase 1 were 4.5% of those that were permitted. And that they are counted by the protected species observers that are out there on the boats at the time of the operation. And they're reported to the National Marine Fisheries Service. It's the National Marine Fisheries Service who issues the permits.
I think it's also important to, again, sort of reiterate that the major causes of deaths of marine mammals are vessel strikes and entanglement with fishing gear. And so those, those are by far, those are the two big killers. And so I think we need to put a lot of this in perspective when we think about this. You both mentioned not putting wind farms near where endangered species are. Is there any attention paid to the fish population, such as lobsters or other creatures that are not mammals?
There is a lot of folks, not as many. There's the marine mammals are the popular kids in school, high school. The fish, not so popular. But there's a lot of people worried about fish because fish feed people and fish feed whales. So we are worried about the effect of construction on fish populations, electromagnetic, the cables affecting lobster migrations. Professor King did some really interesting work on the effect of the electrical cable on migrations of lobsters in Long Island Sound. So people are worried about that. I believe the effects have been minimal, if not measurable. But the fish are important. I've got some colleagues. Art Popper at the University of Maryland retired recently, but he says fish are more important than whales because we eat fish. We don't eat whales. So from a humankind point of view, we should be thinking more about the fish. So
we don't eat whales in this country, but some places they do.
Yes, you're right. Yeah. Not here.
There was a question, we've already talked a little bit about stranding, but there's a question, why didn't the marine mammals strand themselves at the same rate prior to construction of the wind farms?
Most of them did. So it's only right whales, humpback whales, and minke whales that have ongoing unusual mortality events. And those started before the wind farm construction started. We know a lot of what the causes are. For right whales, the big spike in mortalities happened because climate change changed the patterns of where they were finding their food supplies. They showed up in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, where they hadn't been feeding before and where there were no protective regulations in place. And in 2017, 12 of them died. And in 2019, another 4 or 5. Without those big spikes, there wouldn't be an unusual mortality event. So And the Canadians responded very quickly and put
And
in.
that was ship. A lot of it was ship strike, wasn't it?
It was ship strikes and entanglements.
And
Yeah,
entanglements, yeah.
yeah. Where they could do necropsies, those were the only causes that were detected. And there are no wind farms up there, so we know it wasn't wind farms.
Yeah.
For other species, though, like pilot whales, common dolphins, we have 36 different kinds of marine mammals in Rhode Island waters and south of Rhode Island. Those have not changed at all. Those rates, those stranding rates are all the same.
Are the North Atlantic right whales changing their behavior regarding when they're in the areas of these offshore wind farms? And the comment is, in the past 3 summers, there seem to have been more NOAA-issued slow zones that are overlapping with times that construction is permitted.
Right whales are the most perverse beasts on the planet. I've been studying them now for more than 40 years, and every time you think you understand, okay, this is their pattern of migration, they do something different. So this summer, New England Aquarium is still flying lots of aerial surveys of the wind energy areas. And they got a report from a whale watch boat out of Montauk Point that there were a whole bunch of whales south of Montauk. And it turns out there were right whales, fin whales, and humpback whales and minke whales all feeding in the same general area on the outer shelf south of Montauk, not quite to the edge of the shelf, for about a month in August and early September, a place where we've never seen them before. So they move around. A right whale that's feeding in Block Island Sound can be feeding in the Bay of Fundy 2 days later.
Is there research that's going on right now that you know of that's trying to look at potential effects of construction or increased numbers of vessels around construction sites on marine mammals? They're
flying about 2 or 3 times a month over the wind energy areas. They're also flying surveys of proposed wind farm areas in the mid-Atlantic. I'm not involved in that one. They're also flying in the Gulf of Maine.
And who's they? Just so the audience knows.
New England Aquarium is flying surveys from this area to the north, and there's a group, what's it called? Azura is flying under contract with the National Marine Fisheries Service off of New Jersey and the mid-Atlantic. There's other surveys going on further south that are Navy funded.
And so these are for the wind farms that are presently out there, not just Block Island, right? Or
they're for wind farms that are presently out there and wind farms that are planned. So there's lots of plans for wind farms in the central Gulf of Maine that are completely different construction. They're floating wind farms that are anchored to the seafloor with long cables or chains. And those areas are being surveyed in advance. The surveys that are going on by Block Island and Nantucket, those started in 2011. So they started way before the construction was begun.
Yeah, I think there's been a couple of questions talking about how are we focusing only on Block Island, which is a very small 5-turbine wind farm, compared to some of these big commercial farms, South Fork, Revolution, Vineyard Wind, that are larger turbines, larger towers. But what I'm hearing you saying is that they are actively researching those areas as well.
Yes.
And we're also acoustically monitoring all of those wind farms. We've had equipment for the construction at all of them. So this is a project sponsored by BOEM, led by a company called HDR, with Scripps, Woods Hole, URI, Inspire Environmental in Newport. There's lots of efforts looking and monitoring the effects, or to try to understand any potential effects of the construction and operation on the marine life.
One more very specific question. Is there a detection bias related to the unusual mortality events? In other words, did we change the way we were looking for mortality?
I don't think so. There may be a slight bias because we're doing more surveys now because of the wind farm construction and planning. So there's more surveys in more areas. So the probability of detecting a dead whale that's floating offshore may be higher now. But this is a place in the world where there are people on the beaches year round. So if a dead whale washes up on the beach, I don't think the probability of detecting it has gone up or down in the last 50 years.
Just a general question, because we're sort of running out of time a bit. We've been talking about whale deaths and whether there's a link between offshore wind and whale deaths, and it seems like whales are the big issue for opponents of offshore wind industry. But given the fact that there's not scientific evidence that offshore wind is causing deaths, why do you think people are opposed to offshore wind in general?
I collected a whole bunch of headlines from social media articles, and a couple of these are instructive in that matter. Here's one: license to kill whales, dolphins handed to offshore wind power companies in Biden's green energy push. One was the Biden whale extinction. It's just politics. The Democratic administration.
We're so well. He was having problems earlier, but we just lost him. But can I?
As soon as we went political.
As soon as we went political. Yeah, exactly. So I think that it is the fact that it's such a complicated area, that the biology is complicated, the acoustics is complicated, and I think it gets, and it's emotional, and so that emotional energy gets. People start asking questions. Bob's back there. Keep going, Bob. We lost you for a few seconds.
Okay, what did you hear?
Biden's green energy, and then Biden stamped you out.
Yeah, it's all politics. If you are a conservative, you have to be against anything that the Democrats are in favor of. So the Democratic administration is pushing green energy development and fighting climate change. So if you're a conservative, you have to not believe in climate change, and then you don't have to do anything about it.
Well, I didn't mean to end on a political note, but I guess we did.
It's that sort of year.
Yeah, but I did. I think from the nature of many of the questions, we definitely have some skeptics in the audience, which is great. I mean, that's the purpose of a forum like this, is to try to address things and have people like you, Jim and Bob, who are experts in this area, actually bring facts to the table, which I think is important. Jim, did you want to make another point?
Yeah, if people are interested in more, I think we're going to put this in the link somewhere, is Discovery of Sound in the Sea, docits.org. It's a URI-run website about sound underwater. It has a lot of information at sort of high school lawyer level, so it's no calculus. So if you wanted to learn about sound and marine mammals and the effects on fish, invertebrates, docits.org, DOSITS.org.
That's great. Thanks, Jim. And again, I just want to thank both Jim and Bob, and also thanks to all of you for joining us today. This has really been a very healthy and lively discussion, I believe.
And thanks, Chris, for leading us. You were a great leader. Yeah.
Thank you. So in the next few days, you'll receive an email with a link to today's recording, along with a few of our recommendations for further reading and listening, like docits. We hope you'll join us on November 13th as we continue our series with a discussion about what seabirds can tell us about the effect of wind farms on wildlife. So we've talked a lot about whales today. Let's talk about birds next time. And with that, I will say thank you to everybody, and I will conclude this office hours. Thank you.